to go back to the function of the drawing, and you mentioned that this clearly is, in a way, an example of the sketch going backwards. The sketch is on top of the working drawing. So by negotiation, it's in that sense, it's between his own ideas.
Adam having another idea, moving forward.
But this was an internal document.
Yes.
This would have never gone outside, or no one would have seen.
So this is a perfect example of an office drawing.
This is something produced in the office for office use, for as Adam evolves the design, as the design becomes more resolved and more evolved.
And I think it's particularly important that, as Stephen says, Adam has drawn those niches on top of those rather awkward semicircular forms, because he's clearly realised they're not going to work. Of course, we know Adam's whole preoccupation with this space is to make the ceiling height, that 4.3 metre low Jacobean ceiling height, feel higher, and of course we know he does that with the wonderful repetitious use of pilasters. But you can actually see on this drawing that the use of those semicircular forms actually makes the ceiling appear lower. He's actually contradicting himself, and the forms he's selected in this early design are actually contrary to his purpose. So he's very quickly overdrawn them in order to try something else.
And yeah, go ahead.
So I was going to say, it wouldn't have worked when you look at it. I mean, if you look at the illustration he chose for the works here, and this is
we're looking at the works in architecture,
and we've got this view down the gallery from over halfway, looking down over half the gallery, and you can see how he's punctuated it visually on the inner wall with a series of recesses, some round-topped, some square-topped, containing statuary, containing urns, and then you've got the bookcases, which he avoids being flat. So when you look at them at an angle, you don't see this flat surface of all the books. You've got these pilasters projecting forwards, and you've got a rhythm being set up. It's now, of course, damaged, because in the 19th century, to get extra books in, they filled the niches, both round-topped and square-topped, with more books. So you've got a smoothness now to the wall as you look down the length of the room, which Adam never intended. He wanted that visual punctuation to articulate the wall as you look along the gallery, because you can never look across the gallery. Even if you stand in the niche halfway down, the bay halfway down, you're only going to see a small part of it. Most people going into this room will be looking along the length of this 10 times longer than wider space.
So actually the final presentation engraving is done in this very strong perspectual way. It's quite depicting to this, but still to go, like, this is the end of the process in a way.
Well, this is Adam's idealised end of the process.
Exactly.
It's not reality, and that's the key with this publication, The Works in Architecture. It's what Adam wishes these projects were executed
But can I interrupt?
But he's an expert at using these drawings for the works in architecture for propaganda purposes. As Fran said, these are not about reality. With this, he chooses the low viewpoint. A low viewpoint gives you the height and ceiling.
Definitely.
Yes, we're about 3 feet tall.
The viewpoint, the eye line is only a metre. Yes, the eye line is only a metre and a bit up in the room. So it's not the view that ordinary visitors to that room would get or can get. This shows you how Adam evolved this system of wall articulation with pilasters and niches and bookcases to give you that punctuation, visual punctuation, as you look down the space.
Certainly this is the deepest perspective of any of the perspective drawings in the work, so you get that thing that Stephen's talking about so effectively here in this engraving.
But there is no other room of these proportions that Adam ever tackled.
No, of course.
It is lower and longer than anything else Robert Adam had to do. But then this is one of the great things about really good architects. There's something about modifying an existing building, the challenges of working on something that exists, that brings out the very best in a really good architect.
And I'm sure that actually they wanted to retain this room, which anyone else would have divided in the late 18th century, exactly because it gave the possibility of creating a columbarium, if you see what I mean. So that was the reason why it was retained.
To go back to the drawing and the sequence of drawings, and as you say, Stephen, there's quite a lot missing.
Awful lot missing.
But what we have, you imagine this would have been the drawing we looked at before would have been pre-dated possibly by just sketches sent to the office to be drawn.
Small scale ones.
Small scales. And do any of this type of drawings, they survive for other projects, but not for this one? Or
They survive very patchily.
Yeah.
Yes.
Don't know why you know.
Yes, they do survive. Some of them survive, but they are patchy. Because this, like every other project, somebody from the office must have been sent out there to do the measurements and produce the scale, the plan to scale, on which Adam can then sketch his ideas. And then this would all evolve towards a final presentation volume, and at this date Adam would charge 5 to 10 guineas for the final presentation drawing, and then there'd be another category of drawing for which they'd charge 1 or 2 guineas a sheet, which he called figured, and that means dimensioned. In other words, the drawings for the craftsman.
So can we say that the actual working process is that at the beginning Adam probably in his experimentation creates something like this, right?
Yes.
So we're looking at a drawing which today is a kettlestone. It's for a sort of columbarium, which shares many elements with the drawing that we're looking at today. And then he would have given to the office the responsibility of going onto the site, measure, and produce in pen elevations. Then he would have intervened, right? Is that correct?
And one of the great things about Adam, and great things again about every good architect, I mean, he's got them to draw out the exact dimensions here. But when he draws sketches, he's very good at retaining the proportions, even though it is only a sketch. And Syon was a master at this, Adam is a master at this, Chambers is pretty good at this. The good architects can do it. Although there's an awful lot of outlines to scale drawn by the office that Adam then draws on. When he's drawing something like that, he's very good at keeping the scale.
Which is thankful, because otherwise I'd have no hope of working out what they all are. We have a great many of those rough preliminary sketches in Robert Adams' hand. Very few of them are inscribed, and of course I have to work out what they are. I will fail, I won't work out what they all are.
Right.
But the very fact that the proportions are so true is enormously helpful.
Are they mostly in pen?
Yeah, well, as Stephen say, lots of very blunt, soft pencil, but a lot of the rough preliminary sketches, like that one at Kettlestone, are in rough pen.
Pen and ink.
Pen and ink.
Right.
Very rarely, just once or twice, does he use colour in a preliminary
So the
design.
drawing that we are looking at, which is 1162, it's let's say a medium stage.
I would call this a design in the cataloguing process. It's not a preliminary design, which would be a rough drawing like the one Stephen's showing now, but it is certainly not.
What is this volume?
This is volume 54, talking about the sort of sketches Adam did. And this is exactly the sort of thing. You can see there is some sort of structure given where he has to put pattern in.
But this is in a way a different type of drawing,
he
because
designs
these are decorative patterns.
These are tiny
ideas.
details, but in this volume we have drawings ranging from entire laid out wall elevations, single wall elevations, chimney pieces, funerary monuments, across the broad range of his
Well,
book.
to move back in the sequence of the drawings within the office, if we imagine this, there's the type of because we have out these 2 other long elevation drawings of the interior, which are long also physically in their size. So which one of these 2 comes first after the sketch? So this is
this one, which
this
is
the last one. Big one's the
so
last
we're looking at volume number
34. Let me double check. 39. I beg your pardon.
volume number 39, and this is drawing number 2.
Right, this is much larger scale. We've just got 2 elevations. The at the top of the drawing is to scale the what is this? This is the outer elevation with the windows, the series of windows punctuating the wall, the external wall, and then below it, to the same scale and lined up with it, is the inner wall elevation with its door, chimney-piece, door rhythm, and then the bookcase is inserted. The elevation, the upper elevation for the window wall, is very unfinished. There are little bits of bookcase filled in, there are large areas of bookcase not filled in. The windows are just, the window fenestration is just sketched in. The elevation below shows 3 alternative treatments for that, one of which, the central one, is unfinished again. So again, this is part of the design process, but the design has evolved a lot more, and to get the office to draw up even just a section of this wall to the standard of finish and that's shown on this is expensive. So we've moved forward here to something that is being seriously considered.
It's an enormous sheet. It's purely speculative of me to suggest, but it's quite possible that when the linesman was laying out the geometry, it may have been that the sheet was intended to have been worked up as a presentation drawing for the client. I say that based on the scale of the sheet, but clearly it's not been turned into that. This is still at the design process. We still have things, undecided, still things changing. So for some reason at some point, presumably Robert Adam has said, no, this drawing is not going to end up being a presentation drawing. We're going to use it for this this purpose that's earlier down in the hierarchy of drawings.
Right. Clearly, Adam and the client decided to have the inner wall as a Roman columbarium, right? And so this is absolutely finished. You can see here that actually they clearly had in mind how to structure everything, absolutely based on the engravings by Bartoli on the sepulchre of the Nasoni, as a sort of columbarium with all the portraits of the ancestors of the family, so retaining one of the functions of the long gallery of Jacobean and in general 17th century country houses, which were places for the display of the portraits of the ancestors. But in this case there's a double meaning, because it's a Roman columbarium, so it's the perfect place where you would show, of course, the image of the dead ancestors. Yes. Right.
The only thing he's trying to do here to give it some depth is that they do put shadows on. But of course it's as if the light is shining from one end of the room, which it wasn't.
Of course.
All the windows are opposite this, so you wouldn't get shadows where he's shown shadows. And that again is very common in Adam, in that to make the drawing explicable, especially if they're thinking about a client. And clients, of course, famously then and now can't understand architectural drawings. You have to give the shadows that do not exist will never exist in those places. But it gives somebody like the client who is not used to reading architectural drawings, it gives them a sense of depth to the drawing, and you can see these shadows that are being put on. That will never be there.
And just occasionally you find some rather troubling shadows where you've got multiple light sources that can't possibly exist.
There's a famous library that has, it's Saltram, isn't it, where you'd need 5 suns to get the shadows that he's shown on the drawing. On the other hand, you think of the clients at the time and their education and their pattern books and so on. If they certainly had the knowledge, and certainly the Duke here had the knowledge, if not to quibble about details with Adam of drawing, certainly look over the architect's shoulder.
Undoubtedly.
And there is this sense of I'm sure some clients also would have had the knowledge to do that. Definitely.
Remember that the Duke was a trained architect, essentially. He built. And before we move to number 1, my last question is this one. You see that actually there are colored elements here, right? Which of course are the roundels with the portraits of the ancestors, these panels, rectangular and semicircular. Why do you think that these were colored? Just to give to the client, if we are right in assuming that actually this at the beginning was intended to be shown, do you think that these were in color just to show to the client that he had to basically pay in a way for the paintings? right? For Zucchi, for Zuccarelli, for...
They're merely indicative of there is a painting here. This is not a design for a painting. This is why Adam... Sorry, I'm stepping on your toes, Stephen. This is why Adam employs these high-quality artists, because they will come in, they'll be told, right, we need X, Y, and Z. They will do it. Adam has not, as with his other craftsmen, he will, but with these guys, he will not dictate the form of the design. So on the drawing, it's just... Here's a painting, here's a painting, here's a painting. Make them very obvious by using Prussian blue so it stands out, and you have to pay for them.
Right. And of course, these are not... Although in the various antiquarian publications, you clearly had, you see what I mean, clear iconographies for these panels. In this case, they're just prototypes, archetypes.
They're just ideas. These arrangements will have been reused elsewhere on many occasions.
Of course.
It simply indicates a panel, the exact iconography of which would be for further negotiation between the client, just as the tablets on the chimney pieces were.
Okay. So Adam provides exactly prototypes, and then if the client is knowledgeable enough and wants iconographical consistency, he and his team of Italian mostly painters can provide it.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's just ornament.
And if the client can't decide what iconographic program he wants, then the artist certainly can decide something appropriate for him.
Clearly.
There'll be something there'll be a printed source they can wave in front of the client.
Because in this case, clearly this is dictated by a client who probably was more knowledgeable than Adam. Had all the books in his gallery, knew perfectly what he was doing.
We certainly know that Robert Adams' grasp on iconography, while good, was not perhaps as good as he thought it was.
So to move to the last drawing in the sequence, which is longer than any of the ones before.
It's gigantic.
It is the long drawing for the long gallery. So how would you describe this, keeping in mind and comparing it to the two others we've been looking at? Steve?
I suspect what we've got here is simply the inner wall drawn to scale and a much larger scale. It's a good 50% longer than the elevations we've just been looking at. And I suspect this may have been ultimately intended for something to be shown to the client, but for whatever reason was never completed. There are lots of elements on it that are incomplete. Adam's favourite trick when he was showing bookcases would show gaps in them and books at odd angles and books missing, as if it's a working library. And with
the wrong perspective.
Yes, exactly. It works here, it doesn't work there. And then it gets more gappy as you get further up there to the right. For some reason, this drawing was not completed, it was not taken forward.
It's been rejected so far as completing it, colour washing it, working it up, turning it into a presentation drawing, but it has been finished enough to be used as an office record drawing. And I suspect there came a point where Adam said, right, we're not going to colour wash it, we're not going to turn it into a presentation drawing, but finish it, chaps, because then we can keep it for the office records.
Can you tell us, as if we didn't know absolutely anything about this, what is the difference from an office design and an office record drawing?
Okay, the sequence of drawings goes preliminary design, a rough sketch, generally in Robert Adam or sometimes James Adam's own hand, then a design which is measured, drawn by the linesman that Stephen described, and then has the ornamentation, the arrangement drawn on, sometimes to scale, sometimes with Robert Adams sketching on top, as we've been looking at.
Like 39 number 2.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then we have the presentation drawing sent off to the client. We have very few of those because usually they were sent to the client. Sometimes they're sent back, sometimes they're rejected. So we have some of those here in the office drawings collection. And then finally, you have your office record drawing, which is essentially exactly that. It is enough of the design drawn onto a piece of paper that you could recreate the whole thing, but equally as little of it as possible is drawn so as not to waste the time of your draftsman and spend too much money. Clearly evolved from being one thing to another. If it was started out as an office record drawing, it would have been much smaller and the whole thing wouldn't have been drawn. They would have drawn maybe half. So it's been rejected, it's evolved, it's
a hybrid.
The design has moved on.
Yes.
And sufficiently to reject what is an expensive piece of work just to get it that far and on that sort of paper. That's an expensive reject.
It is very long. I mean, is this the type of a drawing you see with Adam elsewhere? I mean, why do you think they did do in this scale?
Well, if you were a client and you were presented with a fully worked up, fully coloured version of this, how could you possibly say no? It's about marketing, and it's this theatrical performance.
And this kind of size recreates the length
Yes.
of the long gallery.
Yes.
The sensation of this
Yes,
very
you've
long,
got to-
long and narrow and difficult space that actually he's resolving in a very brilliant way.
Yes,
And this is
and
what
you
he's
lay that
presenting.
out on the table
And it
in
replicates-
front of the client.
That's orthogonal drawing for you.
Yes.
You don't put in any context, any topography. It would detract from the design.
Of course, and also it's an architecture of the interiors, right?
Yes,
and
exactly.
putting the view of either fiction or real through the windows is only something that comes in later,
Mm.
and with the rise of exhibition drawings. The Society of British Artists and the Royal Academy both exhibited
Academic
architecture
drawings.
from the beginning, and you then get a very different type of drawing developing, the exhibition drawing. And of course, interestingly, the Adam practice, unlike Wyatt's practice, the rivals, unlike Chambers' practice, Adam does not exhibit at the Academy.
There's no financial benefit.
No.
There's no
And that is
financial
why he
benefit.
doesn't do
Of
it.
course.